Good morning, and welcome to another session of #LDeduchat, where we are looking at a whole range of aspects to do with education and leadership during these strange times. Today, I am absolutely thrilled that we have Mary Myatt. Those of you who know Mary Myatt, she needs no introduction. For those of you who have yet to come across her, she is an education advisor, she's a speaker, she works throughout schools with students, staff and leadership teams and local authorities as well. Huge contribution to our education sector, and as I said, absolutely thrilled to have her here. We'll be meeting her later on after her video that she's put together. As I said, Mary has had an immense contribution to make towards what we do within our schools. If you haven't had the opportunity to see her, look out for her and see if she's speaking anywhere that is near to you, or contact her directly and see whether you want to come into your school or your setting. Her video is now.
Hello there, I'm Mary Myatt, and I'm going to be sharing with you in this session some of the thinking I've been doing about the things we might need to consider as we get back on track for when we're fully operational with all our pupils and students back in school. So there are three parts to this session. The first is having some conversations about the culture and the atmosphere and the ethos that we work in our schools. The second is posing some questions about what it might be most fruitful to be focusing on. And the third is having a think about, are there some processes, some things we do in school that we might need to cut back on? One of the first things we need to be thinking about is asking ourselves and our colleagues far more often, why? Why are we doing certain things? Are they really necessary? Are some of them getting in the way of more important stuff that's going to have greater impact on outcomes for our children? And one of the people I think it's quite helpful to draw on his work is Greg McCowan's work on essentialism. This is the idea that we focus absolutely on the things that are going to make the greatest difference to our work. And so it's about the disciplined pursuit of less in order to get to improved outcomes. So one of the things we need to do is to stop. We need to stop trying to do everything so that we can really focus on the things that are making a difference and the things that really matter. And one of the things I think we've got to pay attention to is that we cannot keep adding more and more to ourselves and to our colleagues and just think that life can carry on. It's simply not sustainable. So we need to face up to the fact that there are going to be some trade-offs. If we're not going to be doing everything, we've got to take some tough decisions about what it's worth pursuing and what it's worth dropping in order for us to be able to have the greatest impact on our young people's outcomes. Now, sitting behind this is getting to a place of professional candor where we can have these tough conversations. And part of this is making sure that we're able to be both robust and kind, both to ourselves and to our colleagues, so that we can really get to the heart of the matter. And what's really helpful in helping us to get to that place is Kim Scott's candor. And she's written a lot about this, and she's also done a TED talk about it as well. And what she argues is that we need to get to a place where we care personally about ourselves and our colleagues, and then we challenge directly. So the two have to go in combination. And as she puts it, we need to be in that top right-hand quadrant where we care personally about our colleagues as individuals, but then we challenge directly when necessary. And we expect this for ourselves as well. So it's important that we pay attention to this, because if we don't, then performance goes down and standards drop. So Christine Porath's work from Georgetown University in an international study where they've teased out the implications and the consequences of people working in toxic environments under the theme of the price of incivility. And this very briefly is what they found. Over half people cutting back on their efforts, 80% of people losing work time, not just in terms of not turning up to work, but actually not doing their work fully because they don't want to put their heads above the parapet. And then over 10% of people leaving their jobs. So at the heart of this is making sure that we remember that we're human beings first and that we're professionals second. And then what we've done is we've created a space where we can open up and have conversations about what's really working and what we might cheerfully cut back. So we need to be considering what adds most value to our work and to improving outcomes for young people. So in this section, I've just got a handful of questions that I'm posing in order to open up some discussions. So it's pretty clear now, particularly with the introduction of the latest framework, is that school improvement is primarily driven through the curriculum. And so it's around the curriculum that a large proportion of our questions and our debates and our conversations need to be taking place. So one of the first things we need to ask is the extent to which the curriculum we've got on offer in our schools is ambitious. And this is about thinking in terms of ambition for all our pupils, regardless of their starting point. So this is a strong thread within the framework. And we need to be thinking about that when we're talking about why we have this curriculum in this school, and so on. By and large, we're inclined to want to make things too easy for too many of our pupils. But actually, they can cope with more than we think they can. So when you talk to pupils, they actually say they'd like more demanding work, please. I was doing some work in a North London school a while ago and talking to some students that the school had identified as being high prior attaining but underachieving, able but idle. I was asked to talk to them, and there were year nines, there were about 8 of them, and they happened to be all boys. And when I talked to them about, was there any subject in the school where they weren't messing around, it turned out it was geography. And when I asked them what was going on in geography that meant that they were doing their best work and were really focused, they said, well, our teacher just gives us really interesting, difficult, demanding things to read and to talk about. And we just want to crack on with it. And when I was in that teacher's classroom later that day, she had the same high level provision for all students, regardless of their starting points. And the weaker students were supported to get there. And no surprise that geography were the best results in that school, and a very high performing school. But the teacher didn't give them that work in order to get great results. The great results follow from them being given really thoughtful, demanding work that was technically above their pay grade. They were supported to get there. Now, the next example very quickly is from primary school. This is from Alison Peacock's book from 2015. Assessment for Learning Without Limits. And in this book, she and a colleague are interviewing some pupils as they go from year 5 into year 6. And they're asking them about what they think of ability tables. But actually, the children's responses about the level of work and the level of challenge that they are being given. So this is what they had to say. The first day the children were back, we asked them what they thought of ability groups. The answers were astounding. The more able loved it. They enjoyed being the bright ones and having special challenges set by the teacher. The middle group were annoyed they didn't get the same work and challenges as the other group. They wanted to try harder work, but they'd worked out they'd never be moved up as there were only 6 seats on the top table. The less able were affected the most. They felt dumb, useless. They thought they'd never be allowed challenges as they usually worked with a teaching assistant. And this less able group liked the sound of some of the challenges the top group had, but they knew they would never get the chance. So what we can take from this is that children relish the chance to do difficult, demanding work with appropriate support. So we need to be thinking about high challenge for these children accompanied by low threat. We like doing difficult, demanding things as long as we're appropriately supported, and there's no shame in getting things wrong. So the next question we need to be asking is around subjects, whether this is in primary or secondary. So we need to be able to answer the question, why should children be taught this subject? Why is it important for them to learn about things that happened in history or geography or art and design or science or any of the subjects beyond the SATs in primary and beyond the GCSEs, BTECs and A-levels in secondary? So what is the intrinsic worth of the subject, and what would children miss out on if they weren't taught it in our schools? And then sitting below that is, why are we teaching them this and why now? So this is about paying attention to building children's knowledge over time so that they can make the links back and so that their understanding deepens. So we might ask ourselves the extent to which we are prioritizing reading in our schools. And the first kind of reading I'm thinking of is our professional reading. So are we exposing ourselves, and is there an expectation within our schools that we're tapping in to the blogs and the articles and the materials of colleagues who are thinking and writing about the curriculum and their thoughts as they change, because this is never set in stone? So are we as professionals reading blogs and articles from colleagues like Christine Council, Claire Seeley, Ruth Walker, Andrew Percival, Richard Kennett, Ashley Booth, Adam Boxer, John Hutchinson, Simon Smith? These, amongst many others, are sharing their thoughts and their thinking about the curriculum online. Why would we not want to tap into that? And then the more established work in books coming from the field of research and cognitive science. So Willingham, Why Don't Students Like School? So we get some insights into why the working memory has limitations and how we need to be making sure that we support our youngsters to have things in the long-term memory that they can draw on. Willingham also shows us the importance of concepts, very essential really for children to be taught concepts. But when we identify the concepts in our curriculum planning, we start to get greater coherence as we plot those through across the years. And another quick insight from Willingham's work, the importance of story. Our brains privilege stories. And so how might we incorporate these insights into our thinking about the curriculum? Similarly, Brown and his colleagues' work, Making It Stick, where we learn that, for instance, learning is meant to be effortful. If it's too easy, the learning is not secure. Children needing spaced repetition, need to be thinking about the interleaving of different but related topics. So these all inform our conversations about our curriculum provision, and it's this which is the driver for school improvement. Or Doug Lamov's work, Teach Like a Champion, Rosenshine's Principles in Action by Tom Sherrington. So these are just some samples of what I think it's important that we make sure we make time to read these, digest them and discuss them. And so just to wrap this up, some excellent resources from the Learning Scientists and the Chartered College of Teaching. So we have got so much material out there. We've got to make it one of our priorities to develop our provision for our young people, that we tap into these very important insights about human learning and cognition. And then the second strand of reading relates both to the development of our subject knowledge and also to the reading that we might offer to our children. So the reason that reading is such an important thread is that it's a strong thread in the latest framework, the extent to which schools are promoting reading beyond literacy in primary and English in secondary. How is reading developed across the curriculum? And as we select books, our own subject knowledge is deepened, but we're also offering our children a richness that is going to develop their vocabulary, support their background knowledge or the hinterland, and provide them with more complex vocabulary and concepts than they would normally encounter in everyday life. So it's really worth thinking about and planning for how we're going to develop reading across the curriculum. So just a few examples here then. Well, as Andy, just before I go into that, as Andy Tharby, who is head of English and one of the research leads at the Durrington School in, which is a research school in Worthing, he talks about the text being the beating heart of the lesson, that we don't need to be dumbing things down, we don't need to be making things too easy for children. Let the text sing, and then we as teachers support all our children to get there. So just a few examples here. Sabina Radeva's wonderful work on Charles Darwin, The Origin of Species. In history, using the story of the Great Plague, providing rich vocabulary and ideas to support a unit in history on the Great Plague, and then possibly into the Great Fire of London. Children need to hear this richness of language and ideas in order to develop their overall, but particularly because we know that reading ability, the standards of reading for emerging readers, you know, all our young children in school, lags behind their listening and their speaking. So it's really important that we offer them this rich stuff, because then their reading is going to follow on from that. So it's important that they hear this marvelous language from these great texts and discuss it with teachers, because that's going to inform their thinking and their writing overall. Madha Jaffrey's lovely book, Seasons of Splendor, great for RE. Some schools in secondary are using extracts from Yuval Harari's Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, Gombrich's Little History of the World, absolutely fantastic for upper Key Stage 2 and into Key Stage 3. And then there are texts and materials and stories for every part of the curriculum. And there are plenty, and an example here of Alex's adventures in Numberland. So might not necessarily use this in a lesson, but we might want to use extracts for children to read, as in that geography example, and then talk about it at the start of the next lesson or at some point in the next lesson. So the next question we might want to ask ourselves is about resources, and thinking about whether the resources we're offering our children reflect the ambition that's likely to be expressed in our intent statements. And I think this is where there's some work still to be done. Sometimes there's a bit of drift between the two. So one of the questions we might want to ask ourselves is what I'm offering my children, is it useful? Is it going to move their learning on? And is it beautiful? Is it beautifully designed? I don't mean is it covered in butterflies and sparkles, but is it really carefully designed so it doesn't put too much overload, cognitive overload onto them? Has it been carefully thought through to support learning? Do my resources privilege thinking over task completion? So what I'm getting at here is that you quite often talk to children about what they've got in their books, and they've completed worksheets, they're stuck in, they've probably been ticked off on some spreadsheet, having been turned green for that KPI. But when you talk to children, for instance, you know, about homophones, which they've only done a few lessons before, they're not able to say, even though they've got the thing complete. And that's because they've probably been asked whether they finished something rather than what have they learnt. So whatever I offer my children, am I making sure it's really making them think as opposed to just quickly finishing something? Is it likely to take them to a place of mastery? Now, this won't happen every lesson, but am I preparing materials that are going to take children to a place where they can do something on their own terms in a new context as a result of what they've been taught? And this can't be rushed. It has to be done over time, thoughtfully, carefully, with plenty of discussion around it. Or are we outsourcing the resourcing to second-rate websites? Because that's the easy thing to do, particularly if we're feeling overloaded, is just to see what's on the internet. But the problem is that some of them are just simply not doing what they should be doing to support and develop children's learning. So if, for instance, we're learning about the interior of a mosque, are we going to the actual source material of the interior of a mosque to be able to show children the actual images, or are we downloading scrappy line drawings where children have just got to fill in the gaps? So what I'm arguing here is that any resource we use in our classes, there should be as close as possible a line back to an original and authentic source. Because that's, I'm arguing that's their entitlement, but actually that's where the richness of the curriculum matter lies. So for instance, in history, there's a wonderful resource, Teaching History with 100 Objects, which is free on the British Museum site. So if, for instance, I'm teaching about ancient Greek myths in an English unit, or in history in Key Stage 2, and we're learning about the myth of Demeter and Persephone, why wouldn't I show my children artifacts and images and ceramics from the ancient world and fabulous works of art? So again, there's this line back to authentic sources rather than through second or third rate material that's just been downloaded from website. Because alongside this, what we've got is material that says more information about the object, the bigger picture, so nice bit of hinterland and background provided there, some teaching ideas and what might happen in the classroom. Now, the reason we've got some security about these sorts of resources is that they've been developed by the experts in the field using the source material and alongside teachers, and they're free. So this is a thread of thinking about curriculum provision where we make sure that what lands on children's desks is as strong and as authentic as possible. So what I've done is I've prepared about half a dozen websites with these principles in mind for each of the national curriculum areas, just as starting points, all carefully sourced and prepared, no charge to schools. And I'll make sure there's a link to that with these, that goes with this material, this session. It's also on my website, marymyatt.com, under resources, downloadable resources. So thinking then about what has most value, we need to be thinking, if we're going to be focusing on the things that have most value, what are we going to cut? And this is where we've got to have some trade-offs, although I think sometimes it's going to be easier to say we can do less of this. So one of the things we need to be thinking about really pruning back is marking. The time that would be saved if we really cut back on marking and focused on feedback, formative assessment in lessons where it has most impact. Discussions with children in classrooms is where feedback is strongest, or summarizing through skimming books what are the main things that might need to be revisited next lesson. So the schools that are doing whole class feedback are finding it's having much greater impact for pupils. Pupils much prefer it, and it's saving teachers time so that we can get on with doing the other things that are going to have greater impact. What else might be cut? Well, I think we'll have a hard look at the data that's gathered in schools. I think we've got some questions to ask about why it is that the framework says that it's not going to look at internally generated school data. It's going to have conversations about the published data, but the fact is that most internally generated school data is neither valid nor reliable. So we've got to have some very tough conversations about that. What is it that is going on? So we've got the data myth in that we've got a data deluge. We've got masses of spreadsheets containing numbers which bear very little correlation to what children can actually do and what they actually know. And yet at the same time, it's just not providing us with useful information. What might we think about instead? Well, Christine Council says that the curriculum is the progression model. And it's this thinking that has been picked up within the framework. And it is as straightforward as, I have taught it, have my children got it? How do I know? And what am I doing about the children who have not understood it? So if this is now the way we need to be thinking about progress, it's related to the things that have been taught. So if we're not going to be relying on spreadsheets of numbers and sublevels and points, what is it? How can we show whether we're having impact, the curriculum is having any impact? Well, we might consider what it is that inspection teams are going to be doing. They're going to be looking at children's work. the things they have produced, some of which might be written work, but it could be other things as well. It could be artifacts, it could be artwork, it could be any manner of things. It could be, you know, the results of quizzes, low stakes quizzes, etc. So the things that children produce. The second thing that they're doing is they're talking to children about some of the things they have learnt, not in a pub quizzy kind of way, but in a more general way of some of the important things that they remember from what they have been taught in the past. And they'll be having conversations with teachers about what their views are on the extent to which children are secure in the things that have been taught. So it's a much more nuanced, much more holistic view of thinking about progress. And one of the other things we might want to consider is tapping into the idea that we do know good work when we see it. So we shouldn't be thinking that we need numbers to validate what we actually know. We can tell whether something is stronger than another. We're good at making comparisons, and it's this insight that I think it's worth paying far more attention to. And so plenty of schools now are using comparative judgment. No more marking is one example. There are others as well, which is showing far greater reliability when we're looking at samples of children's work at scale. So a much more grounded, holistic way of considering quality in terms of outcomes of the provision. So to wrap up, as we do this work, as we reshape our priorities and start saying some things are more important and we're going to cut others in order to find time to do more of the important stuff which is going to have greater impact, we need to remember as we go about this that we're human beings first, that we're professionals second, that the young people we work with are human beings first and their learners second. So I hope that was helpful. And just to let you know that I have a separate site, marymyattlab.com, where I've got quite a few free short videos picking up some of the threads of what we've discussed today. Thank you.
Absolutely brilliant insight into what our world can look like within our schools. I was busy scribbling notes all the way through that, even though I've seen it a couple of times. Thank you so much, Mary. I'd like to just welcome you online, Mary.
Oh, a pleasure to be here. I'm just so sorry I sounded like a drunken sailor half the time through that. So apologies, colleagues. Hopefully it's clearer when it goes up on your YouTube channel.
It'll be fine. It'll be fine. Absolutely fine. There's so much. Now, I'm going to jump straight to the questions, if that's okay, Mary. Where would you like to start on the questions that have been asked?
So I think Chris Reddy's question had a lot of up votes, including mine. And that was, do I think that the fear of Ofsted and demonstrable progress hampers the action of placing thinking above task completion? In other words, the need for evidence a lot of the time. So I think that plenty of things can be laid that have had at Ofsted's door that have had a negative impact on some practices in school. But actually, I don't think that this is one of them, because even under the previous framework, the judgments talked about, the criteria talked about pupils and students making rapid and sustained progress over time. And what they meant by that, it was very clear, was a key stage. So now the shortest key stage is 2 years. But somehow this got devolved into having to show micro steps of progress. And, you know, on a regular basis, I would be having people getting in contact and saying, well, I've got to show progress every 10 minutes in my lessons. This is what is expected in my school. What do you suggest? To which my response is, I've no idea. Why don't you get them to model it? It's just a completely bonkers state of affairs. We know that learning takes time. Things need to be revisited. You cannot have these false proxies for learning, which is why I think we've got into a lot of trouble about trying to prove that children have completed something, but we've got to shift the questions away from have you finished to, well, tell me what you've learned. And so what I think is really helpful in this latest framework is it's very clear that the teaching of the curriculum is the progression model. And so that's why, you know, levels, grade descriptors, GCSE grade descriptors being used in Key Stage 3, points and subpoints are a complete distortion of what's going on, and what we need and what is happening. Actually, I'm delighted to see in the practice of the framework when it's being used in schools, is there's this sampling of children's work, and notice I say work, which then includes books, but their work can be more than that. Talking to children about what they have learnt, and then conversations with teachers and senior leaders or whoever about actually how do we know whether they've really got something or not. And so one of the things I'm slightly concerned about at the moment is this focus on books and book scrutiny and evidence and all the rest of it, because frankly, if the child can't talk about what is in their book, I've got to ask myself the question of whether they've really learned it or not. And I think the other thing to be mindful of, that it is beyond just what is in the books. Tim Oates, who led on the review of the national curriculum, he talks about products. What children produce as a result of what they've been taught provides me as a teacher with insight as to whether they're secure or not and what might need to be revisited. So, sorry, quite a long response to that, but I think that's one of the things that needs to be nailed in the sector, that we should never have been looking for these ridiculous proxies for learning every 10 minutes.
Yeah, the thing is, I think it's one of those topics that you could literally talk for a lot longer. So I don't think that's a long answer. I think you were very succinct in actually getting across the things that you need to. Thank you, Chris, for that question. Anything else that's raised for you, Mary?
So to take two together, so Katie's and Rupinder's. Yeah. So Katie says, how would you embed reading in PE? And Rupinder, what's your view on, oh, wait a minute, there was one about maths as well. Oh no, sorry, Charlotte's. Reading is undoubtedly vital. Is there any best practice you've seen for incorporating reading in maths? So just to take the P one first, you'll notice when I was giving these examples, I didn't include the practical subjects because I think that the physical activity has obviously got to take centre stage. That's what we're meant to be doing. However, I do think it might be considered, not a three-line whip, it might be appropriate to think about either at Key Stage 3 or certainly into Key Stage 4, is there reading that could be incorporated in homework? So, you know, something as simple as, you know, the extracts from biographies of famous sports people across demographics, across profiles, etc., just to extend children's backgrounds, the history of the Olympics or whatever, just to build a deeper connection, intellectual connection with the subject. To turn the to PE, so I've done PE, so then the maths. No, I haven't seen any incorporating reading within maths, and I think it could be argued, well, most of what's going on in maths classrooms, and I don't have a background in maths, my background's RE, should be focusing on the fluency, the reasoning and the problem solving. But what I do think is missing in our thinking about maths is the wider stories sitting behind the magic of maths. So there's plenty of material out there, including on the NCTM website, for instance, you know, the story of Fibonacci, where maths has been driven by interesting people. So Catherine Johnson and her colleagues, there was a film about it, Hidden Figures, that sort of thing. So just so this sense that children have a bigger understanding of the territory. And there's a book that's just been published by John Catt. I think it's called The Beauty of Maths, or Stories in Maths. It's I've just pre-ordered it. But again, I think it's going to fulfill just some of this, maybe as background, and certainly in primary could make a lovely little topic, a cross-curricular topic. Say, for instance, on Fibonacci would be marvellous, for instance.
I think, I mean, obviously my background is maths, and you're right, there isn't any obvious reading material from that point of view for students, but the stories behind a lot of the things that we teach are out there. I mean, you've got everything from Pythagoras through to, I mean, even I've been reading some Alex Bellos as well, which you mentioned in your presentation. But there's stories behind a lot of what we teach. Not always is there a context, but there is quite a lot of context, and also how sometimes the theories are used within problem solving within society. So again, there's a lot. I mean, on the news at the moment, there's everything to do with stats and talking about numbers and talking about what's happening. So I think just having a greater appreciation, actually, what is the story behind what we're seeing is actually quite a good thread to follow within classes and discussions. I think anything to do with oracy, I think, would help as well, especially within maths. Just while you have a look at some other questions, I'm just going to remind people that are watching at Chiltern TSA. The discussion is going. I just had a look. The feed is actually, there's so many comments coming out of what's being discussed online at the moment. I want to thank all the new followers that we've got. We are going to be tweeting a lot of the links that Mary's discussed, including her website and other resources that she's got. So if you are on Twitter, carry the conversation on there as well. If you've got photos of you at the webinar, as per usual, tweet those as well. It's always good to see where you are. And on top of that, I know, having a look at the list of participants and the people that registered, we have again got people from all over. So do let us know where you're from, whether it's different parts of the UK or abroad. It'd be really, really good to see where you are, and we can sort of like say hi to you online there as well. Going back to Mary, where do you want to go next?
So I think Rupinder's question about views on KPIs being stuck in pupils' books and ticked. Does it improve pupils' attainment or standards of learning? Well, it might do, it might not. So it comes back to the essentialism point. What is what's the cost of typing all those out, printing them off, sticking them into children's books, and then them ticking them off? If we think that's worth it, let's go ahead. But my concern about KPIs is that they quite often atomize what we're teaching children. And just because a child has done something once, it doesn't mean to say that it's secure. So I think there's a temptation to prove that children have done stuff because the KPIs have been ticked off or have been met. So what lots of schools are doing is now thinking about their curriculum planning, particularly in the humanities, but also in the science as well, less so in maths, is that they're thinking about their planning in terms of big inquiry questions, big meaty questions, that then as they go through a number of lessons, we're unpacking the elements of those. So this is a much richer way of holding ourselves and our children to account. Well, have we answered this big question, and how do we know? Again, it ties it back into the curriculum is the progression model. If I've taught the curriculum, then I need to have some evidence as to whether children have got it or not. And for me, it's a bigger piece of work than the KPIs. They need to be sitting underneath that. I need to make sure that I teach children, you know, how to identify and use fronted adverbials, for instance. But don't tell me once that KPI has been ticked off on their sheet, they've absolutely got it, because they won't, because a lot of this work is iterative over time. So as you can tell, I'm not a great fan of that, but I wouldn't stand in someone else's way if they can show, actually, this is making a huge difference. I'd also be interested to know what children would make of it. So you've ticked off this KPI, so tell me what that means. I think we'll be surprised. So there was are you happy for me to go on to the next question?
Yeah, absolutely, Mary. Yep, keep going.
And so David's question, David Clapp's question, we've heard so much of the evidence shows that, but here I seem to suggest a common sense approach. Would you say teachers need to trust their own judgment more? Okay, so I think the top thinkers and researchers who spent their, dedicated large chunks of their professional lives thinking about this are much more provisional. They don't come out with statements like the evidence shows that. They say things like, as Dylan William does, this looks like a pretty strong bet. And as we go through this work, we just need to be picking out the best bets. So I think we've got to be very wary of the idea, that the evidence shows that, end of story. So even in hard science, any kind of proof is only ever provisional until the next round of evidence it either confirms it or suggests that there are adjustments made to the conclusions. When you're in the softer sciences of psychology, cognitive science, learning research, there's even less absolute security. So this is where we have got to say, these are best bets. There's plenty of evidence, but we need to incorporate that. We need to know it's there, first of all. We need to think about what impact might this have if we use this in our settings, but use it in an evidence-informed way, which means that we make adjustments. But what I would say is that there are some strands that are coming through that seem to show that if we have a crack at some of these, they're likely to make a difference. So just to pull up some of those, the importance of concepts, in terms of children being taught concepts explicitly, examples of those concepts, this all shows that it's more likely to go into the long-term memory. There's also quite a lot of strong evidence that the working memory is limited, that visually we shouldn't have overload for our children, that the messages we give them through PowerPoints, if we're using PowerPoints, need to be distilled right down rather than masses of words that we then talk over. This is very confusing. So we've got some really distinct lines of lines of evidence that I think are worth pursuing. But I don't think we can then take the next stage and says the evidence or the research shows that, therefore I don't need to have any more conversations with anyone about it. This is about us as professionals engaging with what substantive thinkers are suggesting might make a difference to provision for our young people.
Anything else on there? I mean, there's quite a few questions, to be fair. Which one would you like to tackle next?
If I put two together, so yeah. Mila asked the question, doesn't regular feedback and high expectations help in raising standards? Yes, it does. But I'm making a distinction between marks in books and feedback, which makes a difference there and then to children's learning. So the problem with most marking in books, and there is plenty of evidence around this, not least from the Department for Education, is that, and Education Endowment Foundation, Dylan Williams' work, is that most marks in most books do not make any difference to children's learning. One of the reasons for that is because the comments that tend to end up in books are too generic by and large. So for instance, in primary, could you use more wow words? Well, the child is likely to think, well, if I'd known what more wow words were, I would have used them, wouldn't I? It's not moving their learning on. Or in secondary, you need to explain your answers in more detail. Yeah, well, ditto. If I'd known more detail, I'd have included it. So what we need is a proper understanding of feedback, a deep understanding of William and Black's formative assessment, which is in the moment, in the lesson, moving children's learning on. And so it's this that we know has most power. And then an extension of that is doing whole class feedback, either on the evidence of what happened in the lesson or quickly skimming the books, picking up some common basic errors like spellings, which we make sure we teach from the front next lesson. Because too often you look at children's books, there's been spelling mistakes that have been picked up. The children haven't done anything with it, but somehow that's fulfilled some criterion somewhere that the teacher's given feedback. But if the child doesn't do anything with it, it's not proper feedback. And then also whole class feedback sheets, looking for common misconceptions as well, which again are taught explicitly. And using samples of children's work to praise and share and discuss. So it's this rich understanding of feedback that we need to be paying far more attention to. One of the barriers to doing this properly is the question being asked by Jessica, which links to this. How do you implement this in a school where the leadership team are focused on book scrutinies weekly to check marking, and there's been a significant resistance to trialling whole class feedback and live marking? I think this is where our reading, where we identify where schools have been doing this, where standards are rising, needs to be presented, not formally, but discussed, offered for discussion, to say, look, all the evidence is showing that this is a more productive way to raising standards for children. And it also goes back to the concept of essentialism. Instead of carting class books home, which we've established is not going to, for the most part, move children's learning on, what could I be doing with that time? I'd be doing some reading. And this is where we've got to face up to some trade-offs. It's about offering leaders the evidence. And with this, the notes that I send over to support this, there'll be a number of blogs that have really nailed this. Adam Boxer's, I'm thinking in particular.
Part of what you just gave an answer to now, and I've been looking on Twitter as well, is where you have content-rich subjects, how do you balance out the time that you need to devote to a student being able to say, I've learned this, as opposed to I've been taught this?
Well, this again is trade-offs, and what's sitting behind that is the idea of content coverage, and what I call the curse of content coverage, where the content is taught and we race through, but actually our children aren't secure. So one of the ways to think about this, particularly in secondary, is how we're using Key Stage 3. Because if that has been really carefully thought through, sequenced, there's then a springboard. It's a launch pad for Key Stage 4 for the core subjects. And then we need to be thinking, actually, for those children who don't take that subject as an option, they've been left with a legacy of really deep, interesting stuff that they won't, it'll stay with them. They won't forget it. So it's doing two things. It's providing a springboard for GCSE, where students are going to take that, and providing this lovely legacy for those students who aren't. And one really good example of this, Sarah Barker's work at the Orchard School, where they look at Key Stage 3 and they just ask, what is the richness of Victorian literature, extracts from Victorian history that children need to have so that they have got a really deep understanding when they come at Key Stage 4 to be studying the Christmas Carol. And Sarah says, I've heard her talk about this at a ResearchEd conference, that it could be argued that we are teaching to the test. She knows they're not, and they're not. They're providing this richness. But the children are developing the intellectual architecture of the territory rather than just trying to cram too much in. So the thread of this is fewer things in greater depth is going to pay dividends. It's not easy. I'm not saying that it's easy, but this is what curricular discussions and planning at a professional level are about.
We have got somebody who wants to ask a question. I've got Sadar here. Welcome from Lifter, which I don't know if you know about, Mary. But
no, never heard of them. Sorry, we know one another well.
Okay, brilliant. Okay. Okay, Sadar, over to Mary.
Thank you very much, and Mary. Mary, I've heard you say this before. You say that the brain privileges story, and I know a bit about that, but I'd love you to elaborate on that if possible.
Well, this isn't me. This is me magpieing Willingham's work, and it's been evidenced elsewhere that we're a pattern-seeking species. We love narrative. We love storytelling. We love listening to stories. So this is all absolutely marvelous. But there's a lot of evidence that when we hear information via a story or a high quality text, the learning is deeper. So this has got big implications, I think, for curricular thinking, because we need to be finding on this evidence, I would argue, stories and high quality texts that back up the material that we are teaching our children. And it's one of the most efficient ways to convey big ideas, complex language. We're all desperate to try and develop our children's tier 3 vocabulary. So what's one of the most efficient ways to do it is through story. And if we don't offer this to children, then we're doing them down, I think. And so I'm arguing that finding the stories is a big thread of curricular work. And there's some fantastic examples out there where this is happening. I would have to say, particularly in history, they're really, really thinking about this very, very deeply. But there are a number of barriers to using stories. And one of them is that it's enjoyable. And we kind of ask ourselves, well, how can something so enjoyable be work? But it is. That's why we need to be drawing on some of the findings from Willingham and others' work. We shouldn't have to justify, it's just a jolly good thing to do, but it's useful to have some evidence. And what have I done to prepare for that lesson where I'm reading a story or for part of the lesson, or dare I say, the whole lesson, where it's appropriate? Well, I've found a good text, and I might have identified some interesting vocabulary that I might want to pre-teach in the spirit of Isabel Beck's Bringing Words to Life, or vocabulary that I want to unpack afterwards. So what I've not done is roar around producing half a dozen differentiated coloured worksheets that are going to widen gaps. Probably, most certainly, actually. But so we've got to move away from this idea of busyness means I am effective to actually having a hard-nosed look at what the evidence suggests is more effective. And it feels more, if it feels more intuitive, we've got to overcome that sense of, should I be doing this? And the final problem in the use of stories and text in classrooms, children just, this is in secondary as well, just listening to a teacher reading, is that if I'm in a school which is high tick box accountability, and I've got senior leaders coming in to check what's going on in my lessons and to check for things like engagement and busyness and everyone on task, what does it look as though is happening? It looks as though nothing is happening. Children are just sitting at their desks listening. And so we've got to have some hard conversations about this, I would suggest.
Thank
Go
you,
on
Mary.
forever about that.
No, no.
Thanks, Erna.
But the good news is you can carry this conversation going online. We're coming to towards the end of the session here. I know some people have got commitments past 10 o'clock. So first of all, I just want to thank you immensely, Mary, for giving up the time today and actually leading up today for putting together such a brilliant presentation. So much to take away. I look forward to seeing more of what you're producing and sharing some of your links online as well for your website, so people can actually hook into those. So thank you.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Towards the end of another session, what a fantastic session. My biggest takeaway, and I've seen it tweeted online as well, is just remembering to be human first before being a professional, being human first before being a learner. So from the point of view, retain your humanity in everything that you do. And I think never so important as now that we find that that's what needs to be the priority in terms of how we choose to act in every sphere of our lives. So from that point of view, thank you so much for that takeaway, Mary. Now, just want to redirect you over to what's coming up for the rest of the week. We've got an amazing follow-up to you. We've got Razna Chowdhury, who's going to be looking at whole school maths culture. So looking at the details behind how do you create that environment so that maths and numeracy feeds throughout every pore of your school. And then on Thursday, we've got Dr. Emma Kell, who'll be looking at well-being and aspects to do with teacher work-life balance. And then on Friday, we've got Marcus Ray, who's going back into our final part of our deep dive sessions to do with mathematics and deep dives and how do you prepare for an effective inspection with relation to maths. So that's what we've got coming up this week. Again, thank you to all those people that have followed us online at Chiltern TSA. Do go on to there if you are on Twitter. Tell us what you thought about this session. Keep the conversation going and ask the questions. Mary will be joining us online later. This has been another fascinating session. Absolutely loved it today, and a lot to take away, a lot to think about as leaders, as teachers. How do we deal with each other and our learners that are dealing with the situation today? This is me, Arv Cowshaw, signing off for another session. See you tomorrow.